Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Refugee Welcome Collective Lunch and Learn series. In these sessions, we aim to bring interesting and timely information to you, supporters of refugees. Whether you're a volunteer, community sponsor, resettlement, agency staff, a local advocate, or just someone who's interested in learning more, we hope that you enjoy today's session. How do you say interpretation and communication tools? Refugee Welcome Collective collaborates with partners to provide in-depth training, programs, weekly learning sessions, resources, and on-demand technical assistance for sponsors. Practitioners at resettlement agencies, refugees paired with sponsors, community and institutional partners, and others to support quality community sponsorship programs across the United States. Go ahead to the next slide, please. Just some housekeeping here. As a reminder for everyone joining the call today, there's a control panel in your upper right-hand corner that will allow you to submit questions through the questions box. There will be ample time at the end of the webinar for Q&A. Everyone on today's webinar is automatically muted. However, if you have any tech issues, please raise your hand through the control panel or submit questions in the questions box so we can assist you. Additionally, the presentation, any resources, and a recording will be sent to everyone following today's webinar. This brings us to our presenter for today. Go ahead to the next slide. Grace, are you able to go to the next slide, please? Oops. There you go. Our presenter is Brianne Casey. She is the Resource and Learning Manager here with Refugee Welcome Collective. So Brianne, welcome, and I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, sir. Let's see, and actually, we'll head on to the next slide, Grace. Thank you. Great. I'm looking forward to spending these next, few minutes with you all here. I think, I'm assuming a lot of us on today's webinar and Lunch and Learn are community sponsors or volunteers. Maybe at the beginning of your experience, maybe towards the end. But I think one of the most valuable and memorable times, a lot of times, of your volunteering or community sponsorship experience are kind of those moments of communication where you learn something new about, your new neighbor, or you solve a problem together, or you laugh at a funny joke, or you laugh at something that's not so funny. But then also one of the more challenging parts can also be communication, right? And addressing language barriers. So today I want to share with you kind of a rundown of several tools that you could use as a volunteer or sponsor to enhance communication between you and the refugee or newcomer that you're welcoming. Let's see. And I do want to note that a lot of these tools fall under the category of just kind of like communication tools for folks that might be English language learners or possibly non-literate. And also they fall into the category of like informal volunteer or community interpretation. So I've got to say that not many of these tools are, for sessions for professional translation or interpretation, like for example, at a doctor's appointment or a legal appointment, or at one of the like core services that the resettlement agency might be arranging interpretation for. But I'm going to do a quick review, and I'm imagining, to some extent, I think that it is tough to find good translation and interpretation and communication tools. So I'm going to share these, but I'm also really interested in hearing the folks that are with us today, what tools you have tried, or what tools you might be able to recommend to the rest of us, to the rest of the room of welcomers here. Let's see, Grace, if you can go to the next slide. So this one might be familiar to many of you. If you haven't tried it out, you might want to give it a try. This is Google Translate, and this is they have a website. So there's a Google Translate website. You go to translate.google.com, and it translates written word from one language to another. And it also has a voice feature. Grace, if you go to the next slide. So for example, you go to to translate.google.com, right? And you select your 2 languages. So for example, right here is selected English and Arabic. And then you can simply type in a sentence, right? Are you ready to go to the grocery store? And Google Translate will machine translate it into the second language there. So it's doing it in writing, although if the person that you're welcoming does not read in the language, you can also, if you see the little like speaker icon there and you hit that, Google Translate will read it out loud to them in that language. So it's pretty cool. Let me see. And then actually, if you can go to the next slide, Grace. I also just wanted to make a quick note. This is always something that can be kind of helpful whenever we're talking about these tools. But in general, when you're using the terms interpretation and translation, so like I just talked about that last screen, it was translating it from one language to another. In general, interpretation deals with spoken language, right? So when you go to the doctor's office, and you're the person that you're working with might request an interpreter, right? They're saying interpreter at the doctor's office because at the doctor's office everyone's going to be speaking, right? The newcomer is going to be speaking to the doctor, and the interpreter is going to be either there or on the phone and just dealing with spoken word, right? And then in general, translation is dealing with written language. So if you needed to change the language, take a document, right, or a letter, and you wanted to put it in another language, that would be translation. So it's kind of minor. In general, you could use one or the other, and people will know what you're talking about. But it's nice to understand the difference. That interpretation is usually spoken word, and translation is usually written language. And you can go to the next slide. Let's see. So this is actually the Google Translate app, right? So the last one was you can go to the website on your computer, and this one is you can download the app on your phone. And so you can do the same thing on your phone, right? If you're like at the family's apartment and don't have your computer with you or Wi-Fi, you can use this on your phone to translate from one language to another. You can also then use your phone, since it has the camera in it, to scan a document or to take a picture of some text, and it will translate it from one language to the next. And then also on the app, there's this conversation feature. And so I imagine if some of you have used the app, this is mostly what you've used it for. But with the conversation feature, you select your 2 languages. So in the PowerPoint here, we've got English and Spanish. So for example, you would sit there with your new neighbor, right? If it were me, I'd hit English, right? And say, how was work today? And then it will translate it, ¿Cómo estuvo el trabajo hoy? That's my bad Spanish. But anyway, and so it'll translate it. And then you can, and then the same, if they're not literate, if they're not reading it, you can hit that, the voice feature, and it will read it out loud to you. And then your neighbor could hit their language, right? So they would hit Spanish on your phone and then speak in Spanish, and it would do the same thing. It would translate it back, to English for you. So it's kind of cool. You can go back and forth. Let me see. A word of caution. While Google Translate is easy to use and it's fast and it's free, it also does have, it's a machine translating it, right? It doesn't know context. It's also like going from, some algorithm of language pairing or what have you. So lots of grammatical and translation errors will occur. Like some say between like 5% to 20% is going to be inaccurate. So Google Translate is great for informal conversation or talking. Overall, I'm still a fan of just gestures and using basic language, but this is kind of helpful for like some of the in the middle stuff where you need a little bit more detail than maybe you both have in a shared language, but it's not so serious. For example, I would not want translation or interpretation at a doctor's appointment that was 5 to 20% inaccurate, right? So this is, kind of for fun, or when you have some details like, oh, I'm gonna pick you up at 2 p.m. and then do this at 4 p.m. and then da 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 da. And it's a little bit more complicated than just gestures. So this is kind of in the middle, but I wouldn't recommend using this for something important like a doctor's appointment or status adjustment or important documents or anything like that. But it's pretty fun. I'm curious how many of you have used it. Thank you, Grace. And this is these are some of the languages. These are not all the languages on Google Translate. I basically kind of took some of the bigger refugee languages that are like currently arriving in these last like 8 months or so. But just to, Google Translate does have most of them. Right now, I don't believe Dari or Rohingya, but it has a good deal of languages. And you can go to the next slide. The next tool I'm going to share that maybe some of you have used, I'd encourage you to give it a shot, is Tarjimli. And Tarjimli is a free translation app in which volunteers around the world remotely provide translation and interpretation to displaced people. So the people are connected to each other, and then you can communicate either through kind of like a phone call. So basically you download the app, or your refugee friend downloads the app, and then whenever you pull it up, you select your 2 languages, and then the Tarjimli starts kind of sending out requests, right? And so eventually it usually takes, like it says here, between 30 seconds to 5 minutes for them to locate the volunteer that's going to respond to your request. And then you select whether you want it to be through kind of like a phone call or a text, or there's a few different ways, you voice note, and you can also send them like a snapshot of a document. So it's pretty cool. Once again, this kind of falls under that category of it's more informal. These folks, so Tarjimli does try to, and impressively so, they have a system for quality control, right? As far as the interpreters, I think, self-evaluate themselves, and then users provide feedback, and then they offer training and some test modules and things like that. But these are still volunteers around the world, right? So this is more your like informal interpreter situation. So you still wouldn't really want to use this for some more serious interpretation situations. But it's also pretty cool. Also, if there's any multilingual folks out there, I know a lot of people who have volunteered for Tarjimli and really enjoy it. So it might be worth checking out even as a volunteer if you wanted to provide your interpretation or translation skills. Next slide. And this is the languages for Tarjimli, although they might be updating or changing soon. But that was them as of yesterday. Let's see. Next slide. We'll move on ahead. To note this one. This one I've never used, but comes highly recommended by some of our partners. But Respond Crisis Translation is likely not a resource for a lot of you on the webinar today that might be working with refugees, but they do provide translation and written documents if any of you are working with asylum seekers. And so that is quite helpful. They will translate documents for asylum applications. So if you're, assisting someone applying for asylum, they also provide interpretation for interviews like client attorney interviews, which is quite helpful and get expensive if you don't have someone doing it as a volunteer. And then you fill out a form to request this and kind of say what your needs are. And then most of it is free of charge. And so I would suggest, hopefully, if you're in need of this, you're also already working with a client and a legal services provider. So you would want to run this by the legal services provider also. But it seems like this is quite a helpful resource for a lot of asylum seekers as well. Next slide. And they offer 100 languages, and actually all of the languages of some of the most common languages of refugees coming in currently. Next slide. So I'm also going to put a plug here in for a CWS Lunch and Learn from earlier this year in January, I believe. This Lunch and Learn is a good tool for working with interpreters. It was hosted by, like I said, Church World Service, and there's few resources out there currently for the audience of, for example, volunteers and sponsors. But this webinar just does a really good job of telling folks as volunteers or community sponsors some best practices for interpretation. For example, kind of what to do before, during, and after an interpretation session, and when different interpreters are most appropriate, such as an informal interpreter versus a professional interpreter. Let's see, for example, some of the tips that they give is, just even mentioning before the interpretation session, that like, oh, this interpreter is here to help with communication, but isn't here to, for example, make decisions, regarding this topic or what have you. So that's one thing that you can do in the introduction, is kind of clarify roles. Another tip that they provide is the importance of, of the all too common. I think that we all know a lot of times kids learn the language much faster, right? And so they also discuss the challenges of, the children might interpret from time to time, but just the importance of, whenever possible, using another interpreter, just because that can affect the family's power balance or what have you. So it's best not to use children for interpretation, and they do an excellent job of kind of explaining that dynamic as well. Let's see, and that's accessible on the CWS community sponsorship website as well. All right, next slide. So this is another communication tool. I don't know if this looks familiar to any of you, but basically, I'm not even suggesting this for the refugee or newcomer, but this is one of the more common language learning apps that you can download on your phone. This one is Duolingo, but there's a lot of popular ones out there. Basically, you can download it on your phone, and kind of through different games and activities, you can practice vocabulary and grammar. So I'm just suggesting this because sometimes it's nice to try to learn a few words of their language, and then you can, I've had some volunteers that have been, like thrown out a word or two every time they meet with the family. And another great thing about this is that if other folks are learning English, right, it's actually, proven that folks learn English faster the more comfortable they are with making mistakes. And so to some extent, it's called like the affective filter, right? But to some extent, it's helping others learn English faster. If you make mistakes too, then that means that everybody can make mistakes. And that means everybody can use their new language a lot more. So this is just kind of a cool, download an app on your phone. Don't worry about it too much, but teach yourself a few words of Somali and then share them with the, the family the next time you see them. And the more mistakes everybody can make, the faster everyone will learn a language. Next slide. I just wanted to mention that, like, for example, that one Duolingo that's pretty popular doesn't have many of our target languages, which you might run into. Next slide. So I did want to mention that, so I have actually not tried these three, but you can just go to the Google Play or the App Store and then search for the specific language that you need. So for example, when I put in some of these less common languages, some apps did come up. Like I said, I've got to say I haven't done any of these three. But my suggestion is, if you're looking for an app to learn Swahili or, Dari or something, you have options. Also, if you've never downloaded an app on your phone, it's pretty fast to do. So if you wanted to ask someone to just help you download a language learning app, they could probably help you in like 5 minutes. And also most libraries have little tech workshop times or what have you. So you could, librarians are good for everything. If you've never downloaded an app on your phone, you could also ask at your library. Next slide. I also wanted to mention, this is surprisingly helpful, is just a standard picture dictionary, especially if the folks that you're working with are non-literate and speak a language in which there aren't many dictionaries or something out there. Next slide. one of the nice things about this, I feel like you'd be surprised how frequently or how helpful it could be, is that a lot of the scenarios in it are workplace scenarios, or like school or a grocery store. And so to some extent, if you don't share a language, sometimes it's really helpful to kind of have a conversation around their workplace, right? When you're not in the workplace, so then you don't have objects around, right? But this just provides a good context for some of those situations. So for example, I think this one that I have on the PowerPoint to the left is like a hotel scene. And so, you can even like ask them like, oh, at your workplace, is there an elevator, or like, do you use a housekeeping cart or something like that, if, for example, they, by chance worked at a hotel. So this can be, you can get it off of Amazon, super cheap. So perhaps if you're working with someone who's, non-literate or whatever, this might come in handy. Next slide. In that same vein, Mercy Housing has a housing guide, and it just goes through a lot of basic housing scenarios and information. Next slide. And it is available through the Switchboard website or what have you. And Switchboard is a resource hub for refugee staff, funded by ORR. And so you can visit their website and access this there. But as you can see, it just shows a few good illustrations about, on the left is paying your rent and how that happens once a month. And then on the right, some of the more frequent repair requests that you can discuss. Next slide. And then BRICS, which stands for Bridging Refugee Youth and Children's Services, also has illustrated guides for parenting in a new country. So they have raising children in a new country, raising young children in a new country, supporting early learning and healthy development, and then raising teens in a new country. And so each of these have some good topics about parenting. Next slide. And this resource might not be appropriate for everyone, but it just hits some good topics, such as like wearing seat belts, or for example, this illustration is meant to discuss the different ages for like child supervision and what is common in this country, right? So like you wouldn't leave 7 and under alone at all versus like 11 to 12 years old. State laws vary, but you might leave an 11 to 12-year-old alone for an hour or two. And so it has several illustrations that if that were information that you think would be helpful, it kind of helps go through them in a pretty like normalized fashion to come up with some of these topics that otherwise it might be tricky to bring up in like when you don't share a language. Right? So just wanted to go ahead and share that resource. And next slide. Another resource out there, like I said, I am interested in hearing from you all that are joining us today. I'm sharing with you this guide for language access, understand and advocate for clients' rights to interpretation services. And this was created for the National Partnership for Community Training. And it just does a good job of simply outlining the federal laws. And then it also provides a few different suggestions for, like if there's an issue with language access or what have you, a few suggestions for working with providers to try to come up with some solutions. But it also provides kind of some context around it. And this is actually more geared towards organizations and staff, but I think it still does a good job of providing a very basic outline. And then some of the suggestions, would also work as, as community volunteers or what have you. Next slide. So yeah, so that was my rundown. I believe those were 10, tools around communication. And I'm interested to hear, or you can start us off, Derek, but I am interested to hear, if there are questions in the chat, and then also anyone else's experiences with any of these things or what have you. But go ahead, Derek, sorry.
Sure, no, absolutely. Thank you, Brianne. Yeah, we're going to move to begin answering the questions submitted during today's presentation. As a reminder, you can still submit questions through the questions pane in your attendee control panel. So let's see, there was one question so far that's come in, and please feel free to add some more. But someone was just commenting on for Google Translate. You had mentioned the voice option, and unfortunately, sometimes with some of the languages, like for example Pashto, it is not an option for the voice. So yeah, there are some certainly some limitations to Google Translate, that being one. So at least there is written, but sometimes even the voice might be limited for some of the languages as well. Anything you want to add to that, Brianne?
Yeah, no, and I'd imagine there's some correlation too, whereas like some of the languages that you really would, which the folks might be non-literate, so you really would want that voice, for example, Pashto or what have you. Yeah, no, so that's a good word of warning for anyone that's super excited about using Google Translate with someone who speaks Pashto but does not read Pashto. Thank you.
Yeah, and I mean with Google Translate as a whole, I think you touched on important points about it can be really beneficial. It's free, it's easy, relatively easy to use. It's really cool compared to nothing. It is something, it is something definitely that you can use, but it definitely has its limitations. For anyone who has ever used it, I can speak for myself using it with a client that it's very difficult to get very detailed communication across. It's really nice for simple things like even just saying, grocery, you can just like, if you can kind of like focus on the point, right? And you're trying to say like grocery or and then you can kind of hand gesture and you can kind of, oh, is he saying it's time to go to the grocery store? Is he saying he needs more groceries? Is he saying that I'm bringing and delivering groceries? So you can kind of get to the point there, but trying to have a more detailed conversation is nearly impossible. At least has been my experience with that. So but it is definitely helpful and it's better than nothing, especially when the client's use of English is limited, or my use of Arabic is very limited, or or what have you. So so yeah, that can be definitely can be helpful. There's another question that came in. They were asking about that housing resource again, and where they can find that. We can also include that in our email follow-up, but yeah, if you want to share that just kind of one more time.
Yeah, the housing resource, it's actually created by Mercy Housing, but one of the easiest places to find it is on switchboardta.org, and we'll send out the link after this too, but they have it in their resource library.
Thank you. Yeah, someone else is asking, so you also mentioned the use of children in the family for interpreting, and kind of the limitations of that, some of the potential concerns about family dynamics that plays into, certainly privacy, or perhaps some inappropriate content in terms of trying to communicate, and then you're forcing a child to do that. That's to interpret difficult content that might be inappropriate. And so generally best rules are to have an interpreter, but this person is particularly sort of asking about sort of friends or other community members, fellow refugees, to interpret, and also sort of asking a question about perhaps gender concerns or things that might come up in conversation that might be sensitive, things like that. What kinds of overall tips and considerations would you suggest?
Yeah, certainly. Let's see. So as far as informal interpreters or community interpreters go, I think some general best practices as far as that goes, to some extent, you also want your like refugee friends to be building these networks for themselves, you know? So like you're likely to be working with them for a few months. And you know, one thing that I like to share, just to give a frame of reference, I'm not much of an interpreter or translator, but I have taught English, right, as a second language. And I think sometimes people don't realize that even in the best of circumstances, you know, conversational English a lot of times takes a year or more to develop, right? More proficiency, more like professional or academic proficiency is usually like 5 to 7 years, you know, so like fluency while you're working with this family. And like I said, that's usually under the best, like 1 year is usually under the best case, you know, scenario as far as language learning goes, you know, but like these folks might have stressors, they might not have time to get to English class, etc. So it would be understandable if it even took longer than a year to get to conversational, you know, language. So anyway, sorry, tangent. But the point is that part of the family's job, right, or what they'll do as they settle in, is kind of make these different connections, because maybe they are going to have a neighbor help them make a doctor's appointment 8 months from now, and that's great, right? They're like making these connections for themselves. And so to some extent, you know, there's nothing wrong with using community interpreters or what have you. They're probably going to be doing it, or they probably already are, right? But just the important thing is, you know, just being very aware of those different dynamics that actually the person or Derek, you know, mentioned, as far as you would just want to use a community interpreter in more informal places where no confidential information or health information was discussed, and being aware of, you know, like gender differences as well. You know, one of the best ways is to kind of follow the client's lead and even, you know, like ask like, oh, is it okay if this person, you know, helps with interpretation, or would you rather wait? You know, and so always asking is great. So yeah, so that's certainly a best practice. What else am I missing there?
No, that's good. I would just, you know, I would say, yeah, you know, the fact that you know, you're asking the question about, you know, potential sort of gendered concerns or sensitivities around certain subjects, those are important to just be aware of, be sensitive to those. I always try to remind myself, certainly, and other sort of Americans who sort of swim in the same water of we tend to be direct and tend to ask direct questions and tend to expect other people to sort of be direct and answer direct questions. Whereas then sometimes many of our clients, our refugee and immigrant clients, come from different cultural kind of communication styles that incorporate a more sort of roundabout and more subtle way of communicating. And so listen for those in between sort of subtleties. And you know, so it's hard, and that one's difficult. It's certainly for me, I constantly sort of have to remind myself, you know, that to really kind of take time and listen to sort of the subtle messages that are trying to be expressed, because they might not feel comfortable saying directly no, for example, when you're asking a question. So just something to consider about those things. So while like, and you know, you might, so just for a specific example about you know, asking a perhaps sort of gendered question or an issue of potential concern or sensitivity, it might not work to just say like, oh, do you feel comfortable with this person who's standing right here to do this, you know, to provide this interpretation about this particular question. Perhaps it's about pregnancy or something like that, right? And you know, that they might say yes, but please, please be patient, and they will likely, if they're really not comfortable with it, they will likely express that in some sort of other way. And so anyway, I wanted to communicate that clearly, just something to think about always.
Yeah,
Um,
that's a good point. I think that kind of whenever I was saying, oh, you know, like, oh, could this person help with this now, or we could do it later. You don't even like kind of going down that same road, right? It's like, you know, just like I did suggest, you know, like, oh, make sure that they're okay with it. But yeah, just keeping in mind with the power differential that even if somebody says yes, you also want to kind of be open to cues or see if you can, or like I said, even like offer a alternative so that they kind of feel like it's okay for them to say no, you know, if they don't feel comfortable with it.
yeah, absolutely. And some other things that I'm thinking of is just you know, having another community member, another fellow, you know, refugee interpret. There are certainly some positives. You know, they are familiar. Not only, you know, part of interpretation really is it's an art form. It's not just word for word, right? Part of interpretation is really sort of understanding all of the context and expressing that clearly. And so, you know, them being familiar with the language and the culture, they're able to interpret into English for you in a clearer, you know, real picture that gives you a real clear, good context. But there are also just like anyone. I mean, you could imagine, you know, Americans going somewhere else, and perhaps just for an example, I don't know if you had a I'm just trying to think of an example. Like you had a military officer or a police officer or someone, and that was the one who was providing interpretation for you. Their role in your society or your culture might affect. So, like if for example they're your priest or they're your rabbi or they're your religious leader, they might serve sort of another role, and so you might not necessarily feel comfortable talking about your own sort of private stuff in your family. So just sort of be aware of those possibilities. And so that's why always the ideal is sort of a paid interpreter, right? Who knows the language, knows the culture, but isn't sort of connected to the person per se, because they can be a neutral person who hopefully or perhaps that client feels most comfortable to clarify maybe important or sensitive topics. So, but again, that's obviously the ideal and can't possibly happen all the time and isn't necessary for most interactions. But just be aware of the context in which this specific, you know, interpretation is happening and how sensitive the information might be to that a particular thing. So sorry, I want to keep going here because we do have some additional questions. What do you think about using? Oh, sorry, no, that was the one I just did. What app would you use for simple communication with a Pashto speaker who is illiterate or is just you know, pre-literate?
Yeah, no,
Um,
that's a good question. I don't have any as a go-to. I don't know if anybody else has one as a go-to. They could type it in. I know that there's certainly apps that are kind of just like a you know, like basically like a dictionary in app form. Once again, that relies on someone being able to read you know, Pashto. So yeah, so I actually don't have a go-to. I wish I did. If anybody on the webinar has one, please suggest. But yeah, but I know that there are like some dictionary kind of form ones that that rely on the written word. Um, but yeah, but I don't know of a good kind of like instantaneous translating app for Pashto.
yeah, especially without you know written language as an ability to communicate, I think you likely are going to need you know, more interpreter help and support as opposed to sort of just an app that you could simply kind of use, at least right now, at least so far that we've heard of. Someone else is asking. They may have missed at the beginnings, but do either of you have any insight as to what the most effective mix of these is. What are successful client team combos? What are successful client team combos doing? And is there a common thread? Brianna, how would you sort of describe that sort of general best practice, or sort of what's the most effective mix, or what are some successful groups doing?
Yeah, I can share from my experience, and then Derek, I'd be curious if you have any thoughts. But to some extent, I talked about all of these communication tools, but honestly, I feel like the vast majority of sponsor activities and volunteer activities happen without interpretation or translation or a tool, right? And I think, I've worked a lot with like training new sponsors or volunteers, and I think people are usually pleasantly surprised, right, by once they get into it, how much can be communicated without a translator or, interpreter. So I would say the vast majority of activities and things that teams are doing is done without an interpreter or translator or or Google Translate or anything like that. And then where I see, like some of these tools coming in is honestly just even kind of like enhancing that personal communication that you might do, especially people that are helping more out with like cultural orientation, right? Or if you're just spending a whole day together on some appointments, some of these communication can help you just have small talk about certain topics. And then I do think that people do use, for example, like Google Translate. If you're working on budgeting and you really just get, and honestly, you can even do if people have like a decent amount of numeracy skills or what have you, you could even work on a good deal of budgeting without a shared language. But if you really get stuck on something, right, like electric bill, right, that might be when when you whip out the Google Translate, right, and translate electric bill or what have you. So I'd say, like close to 90 to 95% of what you do without, teams do without interpreters or translators. And then, a certain percentage, so maybe like 90%, and then like a certain percentage, if you're working with a resettlement agency, they're going to arrange interpretation for a few core services, a really important appointment. So a small percentage the resettlement agency will work with an interpreter for, and then it would probably be a pretty small percentage that you would end up, using a community interpreter. And honestly, sometimes that just happens by chance, because a neighbor is always around, or the refugee themselves might say, oh, we're having trouble with this, let me call up my friend, or let me see if my neighbor wants to come over, and help us with this. So I'd say most teams, do the vast majority without translators and interpreters, and then work with the resettlement agency on a few key appointments and issues. And then, just kind of do the community interpreter thing for another small amount of the time. I don't know, what would you say, Derek?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think I would say, in my experience, I have seen sort of the most sort of successful groups, practice a lot and do a lot without interpretation. That is part of learning English, is just kind of the work of trying to communicate when you don't have an easy tool. However, I would also say that successful groups and successful clients that sort of in the end seem to work really well together over the course have regular, clear communication with an interpreter. So whether it's maybe once a week or once every other week or something like that, where they have a scheduled meeting and they talk about more detailed stuff. And then everyone has sort of the context. Oh yeah, okay, we're talking about the electricity bill. We're talking about groceries are needed sometime. We're talking about school, kids need to be registered for school. So, and then over the next week or two, everyone's sort of doing the work of that stuff. And then you have a context. So when someone says groceries or someone says something a lot, shows you a refrigerator, you know what they're talking about. Everyone sort of has some of that context. So that's all I would say, is that it's usually some kind of combination of really trying to work without a lot of tools and interpretation, but then having some sort of regularly scheduled meetings or opportunities to have an interpreter so that everyone's kind of following along with, and some stuff's going to get missed, but it'll come, if it's important, it'll come back up and happen again. We're getting close. I'm going to go ahead just with one more question from the audience. And someone, just making a comment saying the family that they worked with uses WhatsApp, and that's certainly a very common app, and that has some easy translation through WhatsApp. So that's
WhatsApp. Okay.
Yeah, that's a good thing to know, and for others to think about as a possibility. And certainly that's a very popular app for many of our clients. So
I already have WhatsApp. How have I not been using it for for translation?
Yeah. Excellent. Well, yeah. Let me just say here that I just really want to thank Brianne. Want to thank everyone here for attending. Thank you for attending this RWC Lunch and Learn. If you have any other questions, please feel free to contact us at info@refugeewelcome.org. Once you leave today's webinar, you'll receive a follow-up email with a link to view the recording of today's webinar, as well as descriptions of more upcoming RWC Lunch and Learns. On behalf of Refugee Welcome Collective, thank you for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.